Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Wahba, and I'd like to welcome you to the Arab Gulf States Institute, and also welcome our distinguished panel of speakers. We're missing one speaker, but I think she's landing at DCA as we speak and will join us hopefully in the next 15 and 20 minutes. Bessma Momani missed her flight from Toronto this morning, so we hope she will join us shortly. I think if we look at the MENA region, there's no shortage of hotspots, but I think, and I think most people would agree, that Syria is really the one that gives us the most challenge, the most complexity, and probably the most impact on the region during the crisis that we're in today, and also depending on the endgame scenarios that we will see. I think no other issue in the region will have as much impact as Syria. We're delighted to have a panel that will explore these issues today. The complexity is phenomenal. I always have to remind myself of the number of players and who's supporting whom. So today, I think we will get some light shed on this issue, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Hussein Ibish, to introduce the panel. Hussein, it's all yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Welcome, everybody, to this event. Can you all hear me? Yes. Oh, good. Okay, and there we go. Thank you very much for turning up for our event today. We're going to look at the Russian intervention in Syria, which is actually kind of a, in some senses, a Russian Iran Hezbollah joint intervention, to some extent not, and we'll talk about that. And the Gulf reaction to it. That's sort of the Arab reaction, but specifically the reaction of the Gulf states. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin with our panelists, and we'll have a conversation. We'll be interactive and grow organically based on a series of questions that I'll ask them. And after about 45 minutes or so, we'll bring you in and we'll welcome your comments and questions and whatnot. And please identify yourselves. And, you know, if you have a comment, that's fine, but keep it brief. And if not, ask a question that's really a question. And if you like, you can specify which panelist you want to answer. And if you want it to be addressed by everybody, that's fine too. You know, what's up with this? Excuse me. I'd like to ask you all to join me in turning your mobile phones onto vibrate as well. That's something that's very useful to kind of get out of the way up front. Wow. Forgive me. I've been thwarted by technology. However, we're very glad to be joined here by our panelists. Fahad Nazer is a former analyst with the Saudi embassy, and he now is with, what's the name of your company? I was trying to get it up here, but
JTG Incorporated.
JTG, that's right. And he is as of last week, he's a non-resident fellow here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. And Professor Mark Katz of George Mason University. Is there anything more you would like to mention about your biography before we begin? Or is that sort of sufficient? I think it ought to be. If you're interested in more details of their personal history, it's there on our website, and you could look at that. Now, Professor Bessma Momani is unfortunately delayed. She missed her flight from Toronto earlier today, and she'll be coming in as soon as possible. So we expect her to join us sometime in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and so she will just fit right in. But I've worked with her many times before. She's extremely gifted at these things, and I think she'll fit seamlessly into the conversation. So, let's begin by looking at the big picture. Russia launched this intervention in Syria at the end of September, on September 30th, really in response to a series of rebel victories that weakened the hold of the regime, not on the entire country, but on the areas that are most crucial to it, okay? The areas that it was trying desperately to control and that its allies, Russia, Iran and Hezbollah as the main ones, are determined to see it continue to have control of. And so, in other words, there clearly was a sense that this was essential to prevent the downfall of the regime, or at least the degrading of the regime in the areas of Syria that are crucial to these powers to an extent that simply was not acceptable, right? And so the question is, what, beyond that, what is Russia trying to achieve? What are the Russia's partners trying to achieve, and what about everybody else? So let's begin with that. What do you think Russia hopes to gain from this? Let's begin with Mark. What is the goal here? There's obviously a range of them, but if you can talk about that, I think it kicks us off in the right direction.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you here. It's a great pleasure, this is a big question. Certainly, back when I first started doing this over 30 years ago, trying to decipher Moscow's actual intentions, were often quite vague. In other words, that we knew they were doing things, and we knew that they said things about why they did things, or they didn't acknowledge it at all. But trying to get the actual reasons is sometimes less easy. And now, of course, we're in a different situation. They say an awful lot more. On the other hand, this move was very much a surprise, I think. Certainly at the time, maybe in retrospect, not so much. But it does seem that they have several goals that they are pursuing simultaneously. And one is to protect the Assad regime. This is their last real ally in the Arab world. If it goes, then really Russia has no strong position in the Middle East at all. In other words, that everything depends on having this one fairly reliable ally from which it can do all kinds of things, or other people want to talk to it in the Middle East. Without this, it's not so easy. I think also there is a domestic element, that for Putin, Syria has become a domestic issue, that he would look weak if he allowed the Assad regime to fall. That's how many people would look at it in Russia. And so he's determined that he's not going to do this. I think also that, I think that he actually had this idea that, despite all his being at odds with the West over Ukraine and elsewhere, that he could suddenly just turn the tables and talk about a common fight against Islamic extremists, and that others would really join in, or that they would have to explain why not, that this would be something that Russia could actually rally Western support around. That hasn't quite worked. And then I think also, I just think that it serves as a useful distraction from what has become the mess in Ukraine. What happened in Ukraine looked so successful for a good while. Now it's not looking so successful, and it's basically disappeared from Russian press coverage. So now Syria, though, that's different, and so for right now, it's working for him, it seems to me.
Okay, I have a follow-up with you on this, but let's hear from Fahad before I come to that.
As to Russia's motivations?
Yeah, well, not necessarily just the motivation, but I mean, what can they achieve? Yes, what are they hoping to achieve, and what could they possibly achieve?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Hussein. And
thank you for coming.
It's a real pleasure to be here today and to join your institute. So, again, I'm not a Russia specialist, but I do follow Saudi Arabia very closely, and I do find it very interesting that that Saudis and Russians have been and continue to speak and talk about Syria for quite a while. This goes back at least 2 years. And although for a while publicly Russia's position on the future of Assad seemed fairly firm in the sense that they saw him as a bulwark against Islamist militants. Lately, and we see this in the news now, its position seems to be perhaps not as firm as some had thought. And I think that, to me, makes perfect sense because, like I said, the Saudis and Russians have been speaking about Syria for a while, and the Saudis keep going back to, and that lets me think that there must be some leeway there, and that Russia's support for Assad is perhaps not as ironclad as some assume. But if I could maybe provide a little bit of context to why Saudi Arabia is so invested in Syria.
Well, we're gonna come to that.
Okay.
So why don't we finish up with the Russia, and then
Sure.
we're coming to that very soon.
Okay.
That would be great. So now the panel is complete. We're joined by Bessma Momani, professor at the University of Waterloo, among many other things, and one of my favorite commentators on the issue. So do you have anything to add about what Russia might be hoping to achieve here? The reason I'm asking everybody that is it's sort of the single biggest question. Everything kind of flows from that. So I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to add about what might be driving the Russians here.
I think a big part of it is deflection from domestic failures. I mean, the Russian economy, the Russian society, it hasn't achieved any of the major, I think, needed reforms that would have, I think, ensured Putin's success. It basically runs on oil money, which, as we know, is at $50 a barrel, which is really quite diminished. It also really depends on this oligarch support, which frankly hasn't been a very loyal subject to him.
Right.
Increasingly, they're finding that they're more invested in having a home in Cyprus or in London than actually being in Russia itself. So there's a lot, I think, on the domestic front. And you know what? I think he's built up this persona through his monopolization of the media to basically ensure that he can beat the drums of war and through that gain a lot of popularity. I mean, the truth is his popularity soared when going into Ukraine. I dare say it will soar again in the increased fight against ISIS or supposed ISIS, because it really isn't targeting ISIS in Syria, but its attempt to claim that it is fighting terrorists really, I think, increases the value of Putin to the society. And that's really at the core of it. It's about domestic interests. And also, it's finally getting at a big issue in Russian society whereby post-Soviet Union, they really lost so much international prestige. And this is, Putin is returning that international prestige that was so lost. And this is fantastic for Putin because it basically allows him to paint the picture that Mother Russia is back.
Okay, so it's domestic politics, really, and politics from your point of view. I'm kind of fascinated that none of you went to a place that it's a kind of analytical position that I've adopted as a kind of maximal Russian aim. And I'd like to throw it out before we get to the Saudi and other responses specifically. Just to wrap this up, it seems to me that and I'd like to get your reaction to this, that the minimal Russian aim is to sort of preserve Assad's control and the regime control in those areas of Syria that are under contestation, right? And in this large strip of the country running from the Lebanese border, through Qalamun and Damascus and all that, up to the Alawite coastal region, and that's sort of essential. A maximal aim, which is what hasn't come up yet, it strikes me, and this might be a fantasy, but is it not an extant fantasy? That's the question. Might be a Russian idea about a large alliance in the Middle East that it would be the guarantor of, involving Iran and Syria and Hezbollah and Iraq, or lots of Shiite powers in Iraq, including the government and militias and things like that, the Houthis in Yemen and others. Isn't that a kind of, it might be a fantasy, but isn't that a fantasy that helps to inform the Syrian intervention in the Russian intervention in Syria, or not? And so I'd like to ask all of you, or any one of you who wants to address that.
I'm happy to do so.
What do you think?
Well, I think that certainly before the Arab uprisings of 2011, Putin's policy toward the Middle East was to essentially to be friends with everyone, to be friends with Iran, to be friends with Israel, to be friends with Fatah, to be friends with Hamas, to be friends with Hezbollah, to be friends with the Saudis and the other monarchies. Everyone except for Al-Qaeda, who were friends with nobody. And I think that a lot of it they viewed as in terms of their domestic Muslim issue as well. In other words, they don't want to give the Muslims anywhere a reason to support opposition in Chechnya or the North Caucasus. So they sort of saw themselves as building this grand coalition. And then 2011 interrupted all of this. That at first they saw, with Mubarak falling, that the Saudis seemed to be unhappy, and so they thought they were on the same page. But once the Arab Spring turned against their allies in Libya and in Syria, and that the Saudis and others were involved in supporting the opposition, they came to have a very negative view of Saudi Arabia. In fact, in general, in Russia, that Moscow views Saudi Arabia the same way that America, not the Obama administration, views Iran. In other words, that nothing good comes from these people, and that they actually don't regard them as a conservative monarchy. They regard them as a revolutionary regime. Quite
Radical,
serious that that this is how they view Saudi Arabia. And so in that sense, if they could convince even the America and the West of this, then they have allies as well. So I think that certainly you look at some of their writing now as well, they do see this alliance that you've talked about, minus the Houthis. They're not really so involved in Yemen. On the other hand, they want to be able to work with the Shias, to work with Israel, but that somehow also to work with the Sunni Arabs as well. And what they have in mind is sort of the poster children are the Sisi regime in Egypt and the Algerian government. That's the kind of, in other words, here's a case of a secular regime that dealt with its Islamist problem, and the West seemed to be happy with that. They seem to be happy with what Sisi's doing in Egypt. Why don't they do the same thing in Syria?
Right.
What is the problem? And the problem, as they see it, is Saudi ambition.
I think there's a pattern that I see, which is, I see where the geographic connection that you do, but to me it's a Putin strategy to basically fill in a void where there's either U.S. dislike or disinterest in supporting. And that way you really are thorn in the American side, and you play up that anti-American propaganda that plays very well at home, fits into the narrative of the U.S. runs amok, we come in to save and fix things, and that's why you see this alliance. Look at, for example, Egypt, which is quite interesting because Putin's really courted Egypt, and obviously Egypt is a very much a Sunni state primarily. Why? Well, because he can pick up on the grievances within Egypt against the Americans. And so it plays that really well. And actually, I think that this whole airliner incident is really important because this is going to throw a huge monkey wrench in the Putinesque plan. Because if you will, that was supposed to be the counterbalance to the sort of the obvious Shia crescent, for lack of a better term, that the Russians have made in terms of their alliances. So that's going to be a really big, I think, factor. But, Putin, I think, just takes advantage of a vacuum. He takes advantage of a disinterest and plays it up very well into a domestic audience that gobbles it all up.
Yeah, clearly he's seen an opportunity and he's taken it. Fahad, do you want to comment on this, or shall we?
Yeah,
okay,
no.
good.
I agree with Bessma. I think that there's certainly in Saudi Arabia and perhaps across the wider Arab world, there are many who believe that Russia's intervention in Syria has very little to do with Syria and a lot more to do with the United States, that he's trying to send a message that obviously there's relations between the U.S. and Russia have deteriorated over the past few years, and this is his message to, like Bessma said, to fill the vacuum and to kind of stick it to the Americans, for lack of a better word.
Right.
Now, on Saudi-Russian
let's turn
relations.
Let's turn to that subject. Yeah.
So, back in June, the Deputy Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, went to Russia. And in the lead up to the trip, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of coverage in the Saudi media. The Saudis, at this point in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, are willing to speak to everybody, and certainly they see that Russia could potentially be an important player in the Middle East to help resolve Syria and perhaps other issues. So I couldn't help but for one evening or one afternoon, I watched Saudi TV, a couple of news shows, and a number of Saudi analysts went on TV and essentially said the same thing, that this is a great move. Saudi Arabia should build its relations and strengthen its relations with Russia. That many of them pointed to the fact that Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, was one of the first countries to recognize Saudi Arabia. And a number of them said, although begrudgingly, they said that while we still have our differences with Russia over Syria, at least we know where Russia stands on the issues. Russia takes firm positions, Putin does not waffle, and that once he says something, he follows through. And there is some begrudging respect, I think, for that, and obviously the shot here is, there's a clear contrast with the Obama administration and the views of the Saudis. Like I said earlier, the Saudis have been speaking to the Russians for over 2 years. It's my understanding that Putin has been very honest, and that these discussions have been very frank, and that, again, I think the Saudis appreciate that. I've read Dr. Katz's papers on Saudi-Russian relations, and they certainly helped inform a piece that I wrote recently. But like I said, from the Saudi perspective, there's some willingness to strengthen relations with Russia. The Saudis have pledged to invest $10 billion in the Russian economy.
Still on the table?
It's a pledge. I don't know how far it's gone. There's also been talk about weapons purchases. That has been going on for years.
Yeah, but it picked up to a very great extent in July, August, right?
Mhm.
June, July, August, and so. But there was a different atmosphere then. I mean, well, let me put it like this: there have been several credible reports that at Vienna there was a very unpleasant exchange between Zarif and Adel Jubeir, in which Zarif actually brought up the fact that 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudis, and he was asked if he was trying to blame the Saudi government, and he said, no, I just thought it would be important to bring that up. Right.
Yeah, in case
So,
people forgot.
you know, if the conversation descends to that level of let me find something, the most embarrassing thing I can, apropos of nothing, here's a piece of dirty laundry. What does that say about the way things are going?
I mean, relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are bad and possibly getting worse by the day. There's no other way around it, because there was the exchange in Vienna, but 2 days later there was another unpleasant exchange between the Saudi Minister of Culture and his Iranian counterpart in Muscat. There was an Islamic conference, and where the Iranian representative brought up the stampede in Mecca, which also seemed like it was in poor taste, to say the least, and not the right venue. And he was responded to in very firm terms by his Saudi counterpart.
So doesn't this carry over into or does it? That's the question. Does any of this, and how could it not? But I guess that there are answers. So you could say, carry over and if affect the Saudi-Russian relationship, or is it possible to have all of this going on in the context of Syria and yet have the Saudi-Russian rapprochement and closer relation continue?
Yeah, the Saudis have always been firm believers in diplomacy. They haven't abandoned that, although obviously things have changed in recent times. And now the Saudis, as we see in Yemen, are no longer averse to using their military to resolve and to defend their national security interests. Obviously, the Saudis continue to speak to the Russians, but yeah, at the same time, there's a serious gap between the two countries over Syria, and I think it's put a tremendous strain on relations. And, you know, It depends on, are the Russians really committed to Assad? That's up for debate, but what is not up for debate, I think, is the Saudi position on Assad. They've been very firm, they've been very consistent.
Right.
They said they want him out, whether through a political process, or they said that if need be by
Other
military,
means,
by
right.
other means, including being removed militarily.
Bessma.
Well, I wonder if some of this so-called rapprochement is really also signaling to the Americans. I mean, let's not forget that the Saudis have felt that they've been abandoned, quote unquote, by the Saudis and their offshore balancing. It's not a coincidence that I think, when the Saudis went to Russia, they attempted to at least pretend as though they're also shopping, coming to buy weaponry, right? Which is really something that was exclusively done only here. So that's an important, and that signaling, I think, is meant to come back here to Washington to let the powers that be that know that, you know what, you're not the only player in town. And we saw that as well, I think, with even Egypt. I mean, Egypt did the exact same
Yeah,
ploy,
they did.
but also expecting the Saudis in this case to pay up the bill.
No, that's right. What do you think, Professor Katz?
Well, I think that, talking about this discussion about the weapons purchases, I mean, the Saudis have been saying this for years, that they have been holding out this this carrot that you can, we will buy all manner of things from you if. And I think that from the Saudi point of view, there is that Russia needs to change its behavior, whether it's distancing itself from Iran a decade or so ago, whether it's changing course on Syria, that the Russians simply aren't prepared to do that. In other words, that they want to keep the relationship strictly in bilateral terms, and this has been their approach. In other words, you want to buy weapons, you don't like what we're selling to X, Y, and Z. Well, you can just buy things from us yourself. That's all there is to it. They don't want to be limited by Saudi Arabia. In other words, this would get to the image of that Russia changed policy to please Saudi Arabia, that this would Putin just couldn't tolerate something like this. So I think that I think what Putin is counting on is that at some point or other, the logic of the situation will be such that the Saudis have to accept the Russian point of view. In other words, not so much that they don't care whether Saudi Arabia likes Russian policy. In fact, what they care about is that they will be in a situation where they'll have to do things with Russia in order to mollify Russia, because otherwise things might be even worse. In other words, they're playing a tough game. They're not concerned about being liked. They're concerned about arranging a situation where they think someone is going to have to do what they want them to do. Now, so far that obviously hasn't happened, but they can keep on trying, can't they?
Is there anyone on the panel who doesn't think that the intervention in Syria and the military buildup of Russia now has 4,000 military personnel in Syria? That's quite a few. That all of that has not put a big question mark over the weapons sales and the $10 billion pledge and all of that? I mean, are we agreed that it at least puts a big question mark over those summer pledges?
Well, it clearly has. I just think that I would be very surprised if any of these pledges are now fulfilled. That they won't be withdrawn, but they're not going to be fulfilled.
No, I understand they
soon.
won't be withdrawn, but what's the point of that? But you won't. They certainly won't fulfill all of them. That's for sure. And maybe any. Right, exactly. I mean, so that's the question: does any of it survive? Okay, good. Well, as long as we're on that page. I mean, but Fahad raises a really interesting question, which is, and it has implications for almost every angle of this question, which is, to what extent is there a difference, and clearly there is a difference, but how deep is it, between Russia's commitment to the Assad regime and its vision of the future, its minimal requirements, and those of Iran and Hezbollah? So in other words, right now you've got a pro-Assad alliance that is operating as sort of Hezbollah and Iran on the ground along with Assad's own forces. Russia is the crack new air force, so to speak, and technical advisors, and I assume intelligence, signals intelligence especially, which the Tartus base is renowned for anyway. You know, obviously they're not exactly on the same page. To what extent can Russia easily live without Assad, and to what extent can Iran and Hezbollah get what they want without him? I mean, it seems to me there's a very big disparity here when it comes to the way in which they view the future of the regime, and that a lot of there's a rather large potential for, or this is a rather large crack and fissure that could be exploited either deliberately or even just naturally occur within this alliance. What do you make of this? Begin with Bessma.
Yeah, I can agree more. I think that the Putin-Syrian alliance is a marriage of convenience.
Yeah.
Whereas the Iran-Hezbollah-Assad connection is existential. I mean,
Yes.
you know, one is the latter is absolutely necessary for supplies, for
Yeah.
legitimacy, for being the thorn in the side of the Americans, the Israelis, to, you know, basically have a purpose in being the rejectionist forces that it's really built up its image for. Versus, I think in the case of Putin, this is a temporary marriage of convenience.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, depending on the cost-benefit analysis, primarily, which I think is still driven by domestic interest, I think that's a really huge part of this, although it's not to say that there isn't a tactical one like Tartus and
Yeah.
building up now a full-on airbase in Latakia. All of
Right.
that is great, which he knows is going to be a part of whatever spoils come out of this. There's going to be an agreement that those stay, because that's going to be the basically the key
Yeah.
that Putin has to getting his forces out. But I think that ultimately what we see with the Putin support for it's not just Assad himself, it's the regime. And we need
Yeah.
to be really clear about that. I think that Putin is not married to Assad, but he is married to the regime, i.e. that cadre of people around Assad, somebody in that inner circle stays in power, because let's not forget, they have Putin's secrets too,
Yeah.
right? I mean, one of the things that I was told to me that I thought really stands out is that they know the war crimes.
They
And
do.
some of those war crimes, I dare say, were taught in the KGB or the
Yeah.
former KGB, FSB. So I think that that's really important to, I think, the long-term interest
I
of the
remember
Russians.
the car bombings in the beginning of the war that just reeked of the KGB. I mean, they were absolutely KGB routines. Mark and Fahad, what do you think? I mean, is Bessma right? I mean, is that how it plays out, or is there some other way of looking at this? Because it strikes me that it's really very complicated.
You know, it's hard to tell for sure, but I do see it differently. I believe that Putin
Thought you might.
is loyal to Assad himself, the person,
Yeah.
and that this is very much of a piece in the way that Putin operates. He is loyal to those whom are loyal to him. That it's very much an alliance of thugs.
And you think this is a personality-driven issue?
He may not like Assad. It doesn't matter.
Well, he doesn't like Assad,
No,
but that's
he-
obvious.
That's okay. But basically, in other words, remember what Putin is playing to is how is this? He cannot afford to not support Assad. How would this play in Central Asia? Here you have a
Yeah.
bunch of dictators as well, but unlike Assad, these guys have a choice.
Yeah.
If they don't think that Putin is reliable, they
They
can
go
rely
somewhere
on
else.
China. They
Right,
can.
absolutely.
And so I think that for him, in other words, that his actions with regard to Syria have to do with his relations with these guys in Central Asia, in Azerbaijan as well, with Belarus. In other words, that all of these things, that he sees this in very personal terms. And so, in my view, and then, but if I'm wrong, and if Bessma is right, and she might well be, I'm not sure that Putin can deliver Assad if the Iranians continue to support him. And I think that one should never underestimate just how little trust there is between Iran and Russia, that the Iranians are convinced that Russia is always ready to sell them down the river to the Americans, for the slightest advantage.
Yeah.
And so there's not an awful lot of of love lost between these
So,
people.
Could that be exploited by people on another side?
I think at this point, in other words, I don't see at this point either Putin or the Iranians willing to give up Assad, and I think the one who can exploit it is Assad, because if either
yes.
were willing, then he could rely on the other. So
Right.
I don't see it at present as something
And
that we
that's
can
A
exploit.
very good point.
May I throw a visual, Hussein, that
sure,
if I could,
sure.
just to mark, because it's so interesting that you say that there's a personal connection. To me, I would say that, if you were to envision, who would Putin want to have dinner with? Bashar al-Assad or his brother Maher? Right? I mean, those are the two brutes that really get along. I mean, so it's the regime. I mean, it's not so much, Bashar is no matter how we dislike what he's done,
But if
is
you
still
remove
the mild-mannered.
if you remove Assad, what happens to the regime? That's how Putin would think
True.
of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, and it's a good question. Fahad, what do you think? I mean, is there, you see daylight here? Do you see, I mean, we've got, and how do you react also to Mark's introduction of Putin's personality as a factor, as, idiosyncratic way of looking at the world?
Well, I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, there are some in Saudi Arabia who have questions about Putin's commitment to Assad. Again, as I said earlier, the Saudis and Russians have met repeatedly over the past 2 years.
Yeah.
And that leads me to believe that there is some room there, perhaps, that Russia's support or Putin's support for Assad may not be as ironclad as some assume. Now, on the flip side, the Saudis have repeatedly said they want Assad gone.
Yeah.
And I think, but when they say Assad, they may not necessarily be speaking about the regime. I think they may be speaking about Bashar al-Assad himself.
Yeah.
And that's a sense that I get. And again, I think they've been, their position has been very consistent. And I don't know where you go from there. If the Russians and Putin are supportive of Assad, again, the person remaining when the Saudis are clearly not, there's no compromise in that regard.
Well, what do you think the Gulf states took away from Vienna, if anything? And you've obviously followed that fairly closely. How do you think they reacted to that whole experience, and especially Iran, the presence of Iran there, without Iran agreeing to the Geneva Communique, without Iran having changed its regional policies at all since the nuclear deal was signed, except maybe to have intensified everything and doubled down on everything?
Yeah, I think the expectations for the Saudis and perhaps some of the other GCC countries were fairly low to begin with. I think they had serious reservations about Iran's involvement.
Yeah.
By most accounts, this was the United States that wanted Iran to be involved,
No
and
doubt.
I think the Saudis agreed to begrudgingly to sit at the table with the Iranians, and obviously that did not go over very well. It turned into personal insults back and forth. So basically, I think their attitude is we told you so. We said that the Iranians are not serious about resolving the dispute or the crisis in Syria.
Do they
Otherwise,
feel
they would not
vindicated?
bring up 9/11
Yeah.
during a Vienna talk.
Right. Do they feel vindicated? I mean, do they think that some of the other players, like the United States, perceived it that way? Or are they frustrated that this is how they see it, but everybody else still seems to be wanting to bring Iran in and whatnot?
It's my understanding that when that exchange took place, everybody else was kind of at a loss and was a little shocked at how, a gathering that was supposed to be focused on Syria degenerated into, back and forth over incidents.
We heard
that
about
are
that
not-
long silence. In the
Yeah,
room,
so perhaps that leads me to believe that maybe some of the other countries at the table just do not realize how bad things have gotten between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's to be expected. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia find themselves on virtually opposing sides in every hotspot in the region, whether it's obviously Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and even Lebanon. So there's very little. And then, of course, the Iranians by bringing up the Hajj stampede, and there's a lot of almost personal shots back and forth over the number of the victims and some of the possibly some of the bodies of Iranian pilgrims still being there. So it's going from bad to worse, it seems to
Yeah.
me.
So the Russian intervention was driven at least in part by rebel successes in the months before that. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't have happened, right? And those successes were the product, again, to a large extent, must have been, of covert support for those groups by GCC states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, tow missiles and other things like that. So what, as you gather, Fahad, has been the nature of the Saudi-Qatari response and other response? They pledged to increase their support to rebel groups, and have they done that? So now away from the negotiating table in Vienna, talk a little bit about what the Gulf states are doing on the ground to respond to the Russian airstrikes.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir, I think, has been fairly direct in saying that, yes, Saudi Arabia will increase its support of the opposition to help them defend themselves. He said it fairly recently, and he said it repeatedly. Now, there's been much in the media about exactly who Saudi Arabia and Qatar are supporting in terms of the opposition. Obviously,
Can you enlighten us on that?
I wish I could. I will tell you this, that personally, it's become very, very difficult to kind of keep track of all the mergers and acquisitions among the Syrian opposition over the past 2 years. The alliances are continuously shifting.
Yeah.
I think in some ways it's easier to say definitively who Saudi Arabia does not want to come out on top at the end of this. Obviously, they don't want Assad there. They don't see a place for him in the future of Syria. They also do not want ISIS there. I think that's very, very clear. ISIS has obviously conducted several terrorist attacks inside Saudi Arabia since the beginning of this year, attacking mosques, which is a red line that even Al-Qaeda did not do.
Right.
So they don't want Assad, they don't want ISIS, and they, I think from their perspective, they see Assad and ISIS as two rather unpleasant faces of the same coin.
Right. Just one final thing before I bring the other panelists in. I mean, the accusation against Saudi Arabia from Russia, Assad, and others is that they actively support not ISIS, but Jabhat Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, excuse me. And I'm wondering what you make of that accusation.
I've really seen no evidence to support that.
Yeah,
I
me
think
neither, but
Jabhat al-Nusra has been classified as a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia. It is an official branch of Al-Qaeda, and obviously Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda have a long history of animosity, whether it's in Yemen. Obviously, that branch has attacked the Saudis repeatedly. And so I see absolutely no evidence showing that the Saudis would look the other way and send support of any kind to Jabhat al-Nusra.
Would you like to address the question of the Gulf response on the ground, or politically in Syria, though, away from the negotiations?
Well, I mean, just to add to Fahad's point, I do, though, think that the Saudis have been perhaps more committed to supporting things like the Army of Conquest, the Southern Front, via the Jordanians. But the Qataris have been warming up to Jabhat al-Nusra, and I think that's something that's been evident. I think recently, last summer's having that very prominent interview on Al Jazeera was sort of code for, well, let's try and sanitize Jabhat al-Nusra to be a, it's not really Al-Qaeda, it's something new. Or I think that was quite evident. Whether or not there are direct military support, we don't know, but I would suggest that, I would assume that there is something there, that there is a Qatari link to Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Saudis have been more comfortable with either Ahrar al-Sham, Army of Conquest, and the Southern
FSA.
Front, and the FSA. And the FSA is more, I think, as well, where the Americans have traditionally been more
certainly,
comfortable,
yeah.
for sure. But, the reality is that, as you said, the mergers and acquisitions, I mean, you can't keep track whether
Right.
or not, I mean, Ahrar al-Sham, is it inside Army of Conquest this week or not?
Yeah.
And the names change. I mean, we were so optimistic about I can't remember their name, Hisham something, Hashem or Hisham group in the
Yeah,
north.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
so, there's sort of different flavors of the month depending on who's doing well. I think it all just says to the point that the reality of the rebel movement is very fractured.
Right.
The reality of them not having even a consistent backer is an important part of the lack of success, which is something that I think those who are going to be the historians one day to write the story of Syria will talk about this lack of really consistent, firm support for an opposition. Even if we trace back to the very beginning of how the Gulf states got involved in this, it wasn't the states, it was individuals,
That's
right?
right.
It was sympathetic individuals in the Gulf, money primarily coming through Kuwait, that was making its way to, and people sort of backing, I should say, these little fiefdoms of
Right.
rebel groups.
Exactly.
And then we eventually get the situation we are today. So it's absolutely very complex.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to sort of agree with you on that, it is interesting, though, that those fighters that brand themselves FSA increased enormously over the past few 6 to 8 months when the money started coming in from Saudi Arabia, so that, it went from kind of 2,000 to sort of potentially up to 50 or 60,000 people claiming to be FSA and fighting on the ground, probably because it's a very good way of getting those checks and those packages and those shipments from Gulf states who are looking to support. At any rate, Mark, would you like to, from either from the Gulf point of view or from the Russian perspective, and how do you evaluate the response on the ground response to Russia's intervention from the Gulf and its allies in Syria?
Well, I think what the Russians have in their mind is Afghanistan in the 1980s, and they want to avoid that.
Yeah.
And so I think that what we've seen with Putin is a sort of a lightning intervention, and then this diplomatic initiative, which I believe that they hoped would gain some kind of traction, that they would either be able to reach some kind of agreement, or at least get the West on their side in terms of the need for an agreement, because of course the refugee crisis, etc., and to drive a wedge between Western states and the Saudis in particular. That would be not a bad consolation prize as far as they're concerned. So I think that they want to avoid this. I think what they're really very fearful of is that the assistance to the opposition is going to extend beyond anti-tank weapons to anti-aircraft weapons, and this would cause real serious problems for them. But obviously, we've seen the Obama administration is very much opposed to this. But of course, things could change, or things could happen. So I think that they understand that the advantages that they have at present, they might not continue to have. And so I think they are serious if they can get some kind of diplomatic agreement, or to use that agreement to help isolate the Gulf from the West. That's what they're going to try to do, because it's a difficult position. I think that they it's been when it first started, it was very successful, it appeared, but I think that as time goes on, it's going to be harder and harder for them, and I think that they know it.
Yeah, I think they do. It strikes me that they've tried to position themselves, Putin in particular, such that they could get out pretty quickly, just if necessary. At least it seems that way to me. Go ahead.
If I could add just
Of course,
one
of
thing,
course.
Hussein, since we're on the subject of kind of historical analogies.
Yes.
I argued a couple of years ago that as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, I think they see some parallels between the civil war in Syria and the civil war in Yemen of the
Right.
1960s, where I
Yeah.
think they felt that conflict had the potential to be a seminal event that would shape the trajectory of the region, and they saw it as an area where they had to take a firm stand against military coups inspired by Jamal Abdel Nasser, who at some point had as many as 70,000 troops of his own in Yemen. Neither the Saudis or the Egyptians really got the results that they wanted to, but I think the Saudis and Egyptians both saw that conflict as a serious conflict that could shape the future of the region. I think the Saudis are looking at Syria very much in the same way, as a place where what they have repeatedly characterized as Iran's expansionist aims and are checked. Obviously, they don't want to see Iran and its strongest ally and Hezbollah coming on top. Obviously, the intervention of Russia really changes the equation, but the Saudis, I think, are committed to this for the long haul, even though they obviously have their hands full in Yemen as well.
Yeah. And what about ISIS? ISIS seems to me to be a wild card here because you could say the same thing about the Turkish-Kurdish struggle in the north, but that's much easier to define and contain and understand and deal with. But ISIS, this new phenomenon, this sui generis thing, is both part of this equation because both sides point to it, and so the Russians really have cast their intervention from the beginning as a global counterterrorism effort, and they usually cite ISIS. The Saudis and others say, well, it's in fact, as you put it very well, ISIS and the regime are two sides of the same coin. There's a symbiotic relationship based on promoting a sectarian struggle that they both rely on, and that Assad absolutely needs ISIS in order to stay in power. And as they use ISIS as a rhetorical weapon against each other, the group is apparently being able to live up to its slogan, continue and expand. Right? That's their new slogan. So to what extent does ISIS matter in this equation, and to what extent doesn't it, to the specific conflict? Yes, please.
I just think with regard to ISIS, Russian strategy is pretty clear. That they say they're there against ISIS, but in fact what they're trying to do is to smash, if they can, the non-ISIS opposition.
Right.
In order to create a situation which the world sees that the only choices in Syria are, which do you want, the Assad regime or ISIS? Which is it? And that most people will decide that in the end, Assad is palatable, but ISIS is not, and I think that that's the sort of the chess game that they're working on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely. But let's not forget too that Putin has also made what is semi-convincing to his domestic audience, primarily because he controls the media, but that the Chechen fighters have gone to ISIS. I think the numbers are inflated. I think last I heard, Putin said there were 7,000, which seems really high. Under the circumstances whereby there's maybe 50,000 fighters today, 20,000 from the West. I mean, it's a bit high. But nevertheless, even if it's 5,000, 3,000, there is a fear that they're gonna go to ISIS territory, be hardened, and return. Now, I think for those who understand ISIS mentality, you're absolutely right. They have no desire to go back. I mean, this is really interesting, right? But as long as he can play up to his domestic audience that, ISIS will come back and start doing the Chechen fighters that are in ISIS will come back eventually and start, blowing up apartment buildings like we had in the crisis before, and movie theaters and schools and all the rest that it's attributed to Chechnyan terrorism, that's a very convincing argument domestically. Yeah. But what he really is, I think, actually after is not that, because he knows that they don't want to come back. They want to set up the country. They want to create their own state. But in fact, create a draw. I mean, what you're really doing is alleviating the pressure on the Chechnyan autocrat who's in charge today, and basically every jihadist who is not willing to fight and buy the Chechen line, or the current government of Chechnya, or quasi-government, they're going to go to ISIS territory. So it's a great way to export the problem to Syria, which I think is really what he wants to do.
One thing we haven't raised, and this is going to be the last topic before we bring the audience in, but I don't think we can move beyond this stage until we do this, is to bring the United States into the mix. What about the American reaction? Reaction both to the Russian intervention and to the Arab response, which appears to be to intensify their own support for the rebels. And, is the United States being drawn in to this? There are even people out there who will look at this situation and identify a proxy war between Russia and the United States because of the identity of the players involved. It seems completely unconvincing to me, but this is one of the ideas that's floating out there. So what about the American role? Let's begin with Fahad and move down the line, and we'll throw it open.
Well, I mean, it seems that the U.S. is kind of in a difficult position, and I think from the perspective of some of the GCC countries, the U.S. position is still a little ambiguous. I think we've seen a lot in the news lately that the U.S. has begun or has been training various rebel groups, and that it's still committed to the ouster of Assad, or it has essentially repeated the same Saudi line that there is no future for Assad in Syria. But I think the Saudis in particular have had questions about the U.S.'s commitment to Syria and to ousting Assad for a while, and I think there is a single turning point, which I guess was back in the summer of 2013, when the President Obama kind of reversed course on his self-imposed red line against the use of chemical weapons, and by all accounts, I think that took the Saudis and other GCC countries by surprise. And from that moment forth, I think they came to the conclusion that if they wanted Assad out, that they'd have to take the lead themselves.
Yeah.
I've always found it much easier to understand Russian foreign policy than American foreign policy. The Russians, they define their interests and they pursue them.
Right.
The Americans, it's not quite so clear. I think obviously President Obama wants to have just a limited involvement in Syria. What I can't really tell is, what are his motives? Is it deep-seated non-interventionism? My colleague at George Mason, Colin Dueck, has published a book this year on the Obama doctrine, in which he basically argues that it's Obama has subordinated foreign policy to the pursuit of his domestic policy goals. Or is Obama actually much more of a Machiavellian than people give him credit for? In other words, hey, if Putin is stupid enough to get involved in Syria, let him suffer as a result. Is that his policy? And even if it's not, that might be the result.
Yes. Right. But, Bessma, please. I have a response, but go ahead.
Well, whether it's isolationist tendencies or counterterrorism or limited, sort of containment, I think it all just says that, it's clear anybody who's reading the tea leaves can see that Obama doesn't want to get involved deeply. I mean, 50 special forces. I mean, these numbers are just pitiful. So it's really about just using the time, and Putin has basically 1 year to the day to basically run amok and do what he wants and face no consequences until the next president comes into power. And I think he clearly and has understood that very well and has read that very well. And so, the American sort of reaction is a non-starter, a starter. It's a lame duck president practically, and I think Putin is going to take advantage of that.
His lame duckness wouldn't stop a determined president in the realm of foreign policy because you don't lose authority. And that's much more a problem in domestic matters. But my own sense, right, before we turn the mic over to you, is that, if you look at, I think you can understand where the administration bind by listening to Secretary Kerry, who keeps saying the same thing, which is that Assad must go because he's lost all legitimacy, but not today, or tomorrow, or some future date to be determined by negotiations. Now, that's this is an oxymoron in a certain sense. Must go, but not right now means you don't must go. And you've got a completely incoherent policy at that point. The reason, in my opinion, is that the administration cannot or will not identify an outcome, a plausible, achievable outcome in Syria that it prefers over others, and therefore create a policy to pursue that outcome. All possible outcomes are deemed unacceptable, and all acceptable outcomes are deemed implausible. And that means if that's your worldview, you can't have a policy. And what you end up with then is things like this $500 million training program that ended up producing 9 soldiers fighting on the ground. Well, that's a very good policy to reflect a very good, let's say, practice to reflect a policy that pretends to want regime change but actually doesn't, or wants it in theory but not in practice. All of it makes a certain degree of sense, but only kind of in a coming out of this contradiction for which there's no answer. And I thought I'd just throw that out. So let's begin the Q&A and begin right here with Judith.
Thank you very much.
There's a mic, by the way.
Thank you, Judith Kipper. Thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. I just came back yesterday from a week in the Gulf, and I had the opportunity to talk with very senior Russians who are very inside. They're not official, but inside the regime, who I've known for a long time. And also a lot of Gulf Arabs from all the Gulf states who are in a similar position. And what I'm hearing doesn't reflect what they're saying. They are not talking about Russia. Not one of the Gulfies I talked to from Saudi Arabia, from UAE, or many of the Emirates there, and from all the other states even brought up Russia. They are paralyzed by ISIS. They are more paralyzed, which I think we have to recognize in Washington, the abnormal allergy that the Gulf states have to Iran. Reasonable academic people with whom you used to be able to talk about Iran being a country of 80 million people, 98% literacy, a very powerful country of institutions, though we don't like their current institutions, is forevermore their neighbor. You cannot speak to anyone, official or non-official, in the Gulf about Iran. That's number one. Number two is ISIS. Secondly, I would say that about this, I came because this was going to be mostly about Russia, and very interesting comments, but I think we need to remember that Putin is tactical. He said once upon a time the worst thing that ever happened in his life was the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
All of the countries he cares about and all of his neighbors are primarily Muslim.
Yeah.
He is not only worried about Chechens, he has millions of other Muslims in his country. The Chechens are angry, fed up, made war upon, down and out, etc. So I don't think we should hang this on the Chechens. Putin is tactical. Yes, he wants Russia to reemerge as an important power, mainly to get recognition that they count. And we heard that over and over from the key Russian, most of you know him, Mark certainly does, who sings the song, perfectly sings the song of Russian policy.
Yeah.
They want to be recognized. The Gulf states, nobody, Iran and Russia are not attached to Assad. They're attached to a central authority, and they want a price for letting go of him. I would also say that about American policy, of course, everything's our fault. We are responsible for everything, and I think that the catastrophic Iraq war that produced ISIS, not single-handedly, it came from roots in the region, but it exacerbated the violence, the virulence, and the speed of the Russian transformation, because every regime is doomed, and we've seen that. What's left? Only the Gulf. So I think we need to look at this strategically and not tactically, and not to think that Russia hates Muslims. Russian people, the Russian regime, Putin himself, any kind of Muslim. So they're not looking for a Shiite crescent. They're not looking for a Sunni attachment. Wherever they can make a little headway, they will. But right now, they're protecting their base. And we have to think about post-Syria, because it'll come sooner or later, where we're probably going to see an Alawite stand where they have their base, and where the Alawites will have an autonomous region like Kurdistan, and the rest of Syria will be governed by Sunnis. I just think it's so important that here in Washington we try hard to really look at the realities of what's going on in the region, and not our preferred tactical understanding of who's doing what to whom.
Right.
Because in the long run, it doesn't matter.
Greatly appreciate that. I think we'll let it stand as a comment, but does anybody have a reaction or a response? Well, then we'll move right along with the gentleman here.
I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Judith, thank you. Your next op-ed, we look forward to reading it.
Yes.
If there's
We
anything
just got a précis, yes.
if there's anything I've learned in the last dozen years, it's that if you decide you want to get rid of a regime, you got to figure out what's going to replace it.
Yeah.
We've sort of learned that lesson. Putin has a number of times said that one of the reasons that he's going in is that there isn't anything viable to replace al-Assad. And he's sort of said, well, I'm not really supporting al-Assad. I'm supporting his regime because we don't want this to descend into chaos. As you said, it looks like the U.S. policy is more aspirational. We hope there's somebody who's going to replace it without there being any policy. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. So there's a question, and I invite any of you to address it. What is there a real aspiration behind American policy, and if so, what is it? And if not, how do you read American policy? I think that's really the question. Yeah,
Can I jump
please.
in? Just in terms of the idea of a viable alternative, I've certainly seen many and come across many op-eds in the Arab press, Saudi and otherwise, where people have maintained that the worst case scenario is already here, that it cannot get any worse in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Really?
In terms of how many, 250,000 dead, almost 10 million displaced, entire cities reduced to rubble, the home base of the worst terrorist organization we've seen in a generation is in Syria. It's in Raqqa. It's not anywhere else. So can it really get any worse is the argument, and I think it's an argument worth considering.
But honestly, the answer has got to be, of course. Mm-hmm. Of course it can get worse. I mean, there is no situation that can't get worse. I think growing up in Beirut in the 70s and 80s, you leave convinced of that. So things can always, I mean, I never, what's that great line? Things are never, that's from King Lear, things are never the worst as long as we can say it is the worst. This is the worst. So as long as you can still say this is the worst, it can always get worse. You can all be dead. Sir.
Birol Başkan, Georgetown University. My question is to Professor Katz. There was to what extent Russia foreign policy is determined by its desire to keep its monopoly over natural gas market? Because I'm asking this question because in 2009, Turkey and Qatar agreed on a pipeline running from Qatar, Saudi Arabia through Syria and then to Europe, which did not realize, of course, but many commentators suggesting that this is the reason why Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey involved in this Syrian mess, so that they could undermine the Russian dominance in the market. Is there any talk in Russia regarding, oh, we should stop this so that it's going to be, end of our bargaining chips vis-a-vis the Europe? And I want to ask a practical question to Mr. Fahad. Is there any Shia mosque bombed by ISIS in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. So Mark first, maybe.
Yeah, I think obviously, certainly the natural gas is important for the Russian economy, the export of it, and they certainly see it in political terms. I don't think, I have to admit, I don't really see them, getting themselves involved in Syria or seeing others involved in Syria with regard to the natural gas issue. They do certainly see Qatar as a competitor in this field with liquefied natural gas in particular. But I think, though, that in other words, even absent Syria, there's there are competitive factors, and I think more and more, sort of the biggest competition that they are facing is North American shale, and that they understand this. In other words, so it's not so much necessarily what the Gulf is doing, but it's what the United States is doing.
Well, is the fact that Saudi Arabia sees Qatar as a competitor in liquid natural gas exporting and the world market, does that affect calculations regarding Syria at all, or is that simply a completely different file and almost entirely unrelated? Is there any intersection between these policies worth mentioning?
This is something it's very hard to know for sure, but it strikes me that these are different decision-making processes.
Okay, so Fahad, what about ISIS and Shiite mosques in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, I mean, ISIS has targeted several Shia mosques and centers over the, going back to, I believe the first attack was in November 2014, so they've targeted several mosques in Hussein and Dammam, Al-Ahsa and Qatif, but also more recently in Jizan in the south. And they've also attacked predominantly Sunni mosque, if you want to classify it that way, used by security forces. So as I mentioned earlier, they've crossed a red line, and now they're targeting both Sunnis and Shia inside Saudi Arabia. And if I could just add, I've attended a number of events in DC here over the past couple of months, and I'm a little disturbed that some people in this town seem to be, going back to your question about viability of the Islamic State. I mean, it seems that more and more people are beginning to consider the possibility that we might just come to terms with ISIS and that we can learn to live with it, which I find to be incredibly disturbing, whether it's in, and recent polls bear this documented very well, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or across the GCC or wider Arab world. ISIS is absolutely considered to be a repulsive, repugnant, brutal organization that has no future in the region. It cannot exist. Nobody thinks of it, or very, very few think of it as a viable state. So this notion that we should maybe come to terms with it, or that there's enough of a support base for it, I'm not sure what the roots of it is. Everything I've seen and people I've talked to, what you read in the papers, says otherwise, and that's obviously a good thing.
The ISIS bombings of Shiite mosques, especially this year, connected to the intervention in Yemen in any way, do you think? I mean, did ISIS feel kind of overshadowed by Saudi Arabia in a sense? I mean, do you see the connection that I thought I might be seeing, but I'm not sure?
That's not entirely clear because, like I said, I think the first attack happened in November of 2014.
Well, not that one, obviously, yeah.
I mean, obviously ISIS is trying to foment sectarian discord in Saudi Arabia. There's obviously the war in Yemen has unfortunately taken on, you see it in the media, you see it in proponents of both sides. It's taken a sectarian tone, but I think it all begins and ends with Syria. Perhaps I didn't mention this earlier when we discussed ISIS more specifically, but I think we would not have the ISIS that we know today without Syria. I mean, I think it begins and ends with Syria. ISIS was in Iraq for many years. It was never able to generate or to attract as many foreign fighters as it has since Syria. And really, honestly, I don't think it was able to construct a jihadi narrative that has resonated as well. It was able to do that in Syria specifically,
Right.
not anywhere else.
That's right, yeah. Please.
I think also part of that too is that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris to a lesser extent, but obviously the Jordanians are also part of the coalition
Right.
bombing ISIS. So I
Yeah.
think that's also one of the reasons why they've, attracted, or ISIS has been attracted to hit back on Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add
Please.
one more thing.
Absolutely.
And I think the targeting of Shia in Saudi Arabia is backfiring on ISIS. I
Right.
think the first incident, which again happened in late November, I think ISIS was hoping that there would be some support for it, and the exact opposite happened. I remember Sunnis from my hometown of Jeddah traveled across country to attend some of the funerals and to show support to the Shia victims. The Saudi Interior Minister attended the funerals of the victims. So I think it's having the exact opposite effect. Especially again because they're attacking civilians, they're attacking mosques, they're attacking children. So these tactics I think have really eaten away at any support that ISIS has had, which was minimal to begin with.
Right. So we have the two gentlemen here. You first, the gentleman in front with the beard, and then you, sir. No, first was him, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Hi, I am Ziad Saeed. I'm from Iraq. Actually, I would like to ask from financial side, Russian, can they able to move with this war till the end?
Okay.
And,
Can they afford it? Yeah.
Yeah. And my other question, why they delay till this time and 3 years, and after that they
Okay,
handle
good.
this war?
So two questions. Can Russia afford this war, and why did they wait so long? I think our discussion has hinted at the second, which is the rebel gains throughout much of this year. Unless somebody on the panel has a different interpretation, I would go so far as to say that the Russians and even the Syrian government virtually admit that. But if anybody has anything to add to that, we've already gone over in terms of timing. That's fine. What about can they afford it? We'll begin with Mark. Yeah.
Certain Russians I talk to, including those who are highly critical of Putin, feel that they can afford it. That it's not all that expensive. That if it stays at the level that it is now, that they can keep it going. However,
When does that happen?
what they feel though is that the current bombing campaign will not ultimately serve to protect the Assad regime. In other words, that once we get the response from the Gulf and that the opposition understands how to deal with it, then it will require ground force intervention, and that Russia can't afford.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Bessma.
Well, I think the Russian economy is in tatters. When you look at the foreign exchange reserves, it's plummeted. there's a lot going wrong in the Russian economy. But the reality is, it's true, it's a low investment. 4,000 troops, 50 airplanes, and that 4,000 is mostly support and some pilots. It's a low investment for a
Testing some
lot of
cruise
gain.
missiles, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the gain is political, or is what kind of gain are we seeing here? It's the gains in terms of advantage on the ground, Russia standing internationally, the political advantage you talked about, all of that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Geostrategic advantage and, international reputation.
All
And
right.
Putin for his own domestic popularity.
So it's actually cheap at the price. But I would say this, which is that, you're right. At this point, it looks cost effective, but that bill can grow very quickly, and you can be in a position where you've got to pay, and you might find that the $2 subscription you took out is coming back at $20,000 a year instead. We've got the gentleman here, right behind the last questioner.
My question is it possible that Russia will really join the anti-ISIS coalition? Roughly, ISIS claims credit for shooting down the airplane. 224 Russian citizens died. It would make sense that there would be public demands for revenge and protection. If this proves to be true, could they become real members of the coalition?
Interesting.
No, they will not. No, not at all. That I think that for Russia will not accept leadership from the United States or anyone else they might act on their own, but they're not going to be limited by anyone. They just plain won't do it.
Anybody?
Yeah,
targeting is what I really want.
and in terms of the coalition, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's in trouble, but there's been a number of reports in the U.S. media that some of the other members of the coalition, the Arab members, have really pulled back their efforts, and that the Saudis and even Emiratis are more focused on the war in Yemen. So I think for the most part, this has become more of a U.S.-led and U.S. Persecuted effort right now. So I agree with Dr. Katz. I don't see the Russians joining that.
But the question at the end was interesting. What about if, acting not in the coalition, but acting against ISIS on their own? In a way that's more than the pro forma stuff they've done with the 2 or 3% of their air raids so far that hit ISIS. There's clearly a fig leaf for what they really wanted to do in Aleppo and the Lataki area, and where they've actually really been hitting.
Well, I think, if you're, look at it the way that they must look at it. In other words, with regard to this bombing in Egypt, it's America and Britain who are coming out and saying it was ISIS. Of course, ISIS is doing so. I think from Putin's point of view, what's less important is it's not so much the truth of the matter. It's that why is the U.S. and Britain doing this? Are they trying to force his hand? Are they trying to put him in a situation where he has no choice but to get involved in a conflict with ISIS? And what will that lead to?
Right.
So I think he would view it very suspiciously. Maybe he will target them. Maybe he should. But I think that in other words, this episode is not likely to bring about more cooperation between Russia and the West. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, so we've got the gentleman here, the yellow shirt, and then Sigi behind him.
Hi, John Parker from INSS at NDU. There's been a royal succession this year in Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
I'm a Russia specialist, but from everything I hear, Saudi royal politics are far more opaque than Kremlin politics.
I think that's fair.
If the Gulf experts on the panel see any clues or any hints or any evidence that policy towards Russia has played any sort of role in Saudi royal politics. It's gone through the
Saudi
succession.
policy towards Russia?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And has that played a role in succession politics?
Yes, in
Okay.
Saudi Arabia.
All right. Fahad?
Yeah, no, I mean, the short answer is no. I think much has been said, or many people assume that the more assertive foreign policy that Saudi Arabia has implemented recently is a function of the newer, younger leadership. And perhaps that's a factor, but I think the Saudis were moving in this direction in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and they did get involved in Bahrain to put down the unrest there.
Right.
So I think that they were well ahead on their way towards reevaluating their foreign policy and towards maintaining, a more muscular foreign policy. So this is not strictly a function of new leaders, whether it's Prince Mohammed bin Salman or others. Although it's my understanding that he's obviously certainly a public face of the war in Yemen, and but the war, to be honest, is still very popular in Saudi Arabia. There's, for the most part, from what I've seen, and Judith is shaking her head. But from what I've seen and people I've spoken to, certainly initially, I think it was very popular, and it's my understanding that it still remains popular.
Okay. We've got Sigi back here.
Sigi Neubauer, and I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Institute. I have two questions. The first question is for the panel at large, and that is, with the rise of Erdogan again in Turkey, how does the Russian leadership see Erdogan at this point? Do they see him as a weak leader who initially went headstrong into the conflict, believing that he could just push out Assad, and then he has faced a number of domestic challenges and hurdles, which again forced him to call this election that he ultimately won? So that's my first question. The second question is, I'm very curious about the recent visit to Damascus by Oman's foreign minister.
Yeah.
How does the panel see that? And I was wondering, does Oman believe that it could carve out a role for itself as some sort of a facilitator, or was this just a one-time visit of sorts? Thank you.
Very interesting questions. Go right ahead.
Well, I mean, I think, Erdogan and Turkey have really tried to keep their relationship with Russia separate from their relationship with their concerns with Syria, and partly because there's enormous gas contracts with the Russians. There's also we would argue, or I would argue, that Erdogan has tried to actually improve Russian relations from where it was before. In fact, if you look at not just the state visits, but the business contracts, all the rest of the rhetoric has often been toned down under Erdogan than previously, especially because there's enormous legacy there, whether it's the Tartars, whether it's even look at Crimea, which is really interesting, right? Because when the Russians annexed Crimea, Crimea historically, there's a large Tartar community there, and there are many Tartars who look to Turkey to say, wait a minute, why aren't you standing up for us?
Right.
And we actually saw Erdogan be very quiet on that. There wasn't really the kind of indignation that you would have expected. So that to me was very interesting. On the issue of Oman, clearly with the whole Iran nuclear negotiations, Oman plays a very interesting role. The argument that I often heard, just in social media was, was the Omani king bringing a message? Was he bringing a letter, right? So that's really interesting. It's some sort of envoy. So I definitely think that there is something to that visit that was probably about bringing some sort of, acting at least as some sort of go-between, and we've seen that clearly as a role that Oman has been taking pride with.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, Russia and Turkey disagree on Syria, but Russia and Turkey sure trade an awful lot.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think Putin once talked about how, Russia's trade with Turkey is greater than his trade with the United Kingdom. I think that and Putin, I think, is not so unhappy. In other words, Putin would like to have the same relationship with Saudi Arabia that Russia has with Turkey. Yeah, you disagree on Syria, but trade like anything. So in other words, that you can compartmentalize these things. And so I think that, obviously there's anti-American sentiment, anti-Western sentiment in Turkey. I think that Russia has a lot at stake in sort of encouraging Erdogan's go-it-alone attitude. And so I think that what Putin has tried to do is simply to agree to disagree on Syria and pursue bilateral relations with Turkey.
Right. Fahad.
Yeah, so I think Erdogan is a bit of a polarizing figure in the Arab world. I think people who like the Muslim Brotherhood tend to be big fans of Erdogan. People who don't feel otherwise. I think Saudi Arabia officially certainly sees Turkey as an important player and sees a role for Turkey in potentially bringing the carnage in Syria to an end. Erdogan did visit Saudi Arabia very early on in King Salman's, when he assumed the throne in January. So I think that there is forces and voices within Saudi Arabia for closer relations with Turkey. And like I said, I think they see it as an important regional actor. It has arguably one of the better militaries in the region. So there is a push and there's support for closer relations, but because of the history of Erdogan and its ties to President Morsi and other MB organizations, the relationship can be also a little tenuous. On Oman,
yeah,
if I
on
could just-
Oman, I was going to ask you.
Oman and Saudi Arabia at this point do seem to have a philosophical difference on how best to resolve the region's many conflicts. Oman, it's my understanding, does not believe in the use of force, or they certainly haven't used it lately, and they think they do want to focus strictly on diplomatic tracks. Saudi Arabia still believes in diplomacy, and they're speaking to everybody, really. But however, they're also, as I mentioned earlier, they're no longer averse to using military force if need be, and we see that in Yemen very clearly.
I tend to agree with Bessma, by the way, that it's impossible not to look at this as a message in and of itself. There may have been an additional message, written or verbal, involved. But it communicates something, you know, and it's not, you know, it doesn't have to be deciphered, you know, sort of semiotically. It says what it is up front. And I mean, it seems to me Oman is pretty comfortable with this role, and it's worked for them on many occasions. It works because the rest of the GCC seems to feel that it gets a benefit from it, that, you know, Oman gets the GCC as an entity into spaces and conversations and dialogues that it otherwise would be excluded from. So even if Oman is pursuing eccentric positions on the Iran and Syria and things like that, it's potentially useful for the organization as a whole without putting any of its other initiatives at risk. So it strikes me that that's why, for example, Oman's version of independent foreign policy has not been objected to in the same way that Qatar's version of having an independent policy in the past on the Muslim Brotherhood was, because that actually did complicate things. That actually did create problems for GCC policies, but this doesn't. And so as long as that continues, I would think that Oman would pursue that and benefit from it. And that's my personal, you know, response to it. And we've got we're going to do the gentleman with the hat, and then we're going to come to you. So he's been very patient. And so we'll do you, and then you, and that'll be it, I think.
Thank you so much for hosting this forum.
You're welcome.
It's been very interesting. Just some big picture stuff. Number one, how has the loss of trust between Russia and the United States almost tainted everything? Putin now
That's a good question.
seriously feels like he can never trust the United States. As far back as Clinton, we promised not to expand NATO, not to push in on him. In his mind, we overthrew the government of Ukraine, and we're pushing at his door,
No
always
trust.
talking about removing him from office. Second of all, Sunni versus Shia, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. As long as there's this fundamental religious difference that's going to cause each group to almost never be able to make peace, why hasn't the United States tried to force Saudi and Iran to sit down and talk and get over this historical issue that is not, that's never going to change? And finally, China, to me, is the wild card. China is the wild card. China, Iran, Russia, Syria now have an alliance that's focused on a neighborhood that's their neighborhood. We've all learned that you can't win a war unless you can control the ground. You can bomb as much as you want.
No, of course.
But at the end of the day, you have to be able to control the ground. And the U.S. and the West don't have the bodies and the troops to control the ground anywhere, nor do the Saudis. And they can pay the Sudanese and the Egyptians or whoever to be their ground fodder, but it won't last long. Those are my
Okay.
thoughts,
Thank you. I wanna take all three questions at once, and then we'll answer, and then we'll wrap up. So Judith, and then we'll have your question, and we'll have all three, and then that will be the end of the program.
I just wanted to add what you've said about, all of you have said about Oman. Oman has been enormously helpful on diplomatic, political, and humanitarian grounds to a whole lot of countries that are friends of theirs and not friends of theirs in the last number of years. And the reason they can do it is not because of the other GCC states, it's because they're trustworthy. They're the only country that you can trust. If they say they'll keep it a secret, that they're going to mediate this or that they're going to communicate to get out this hostage or this prisoner or whatever, they really do it.
They're very
Plus,
effective,
there's a mountain between them and the Saudis, and they're more South Asian in many ways than they are Arab.
That's all very helpful, and that's all true, and I appreciate it. I still think the GCC finds it useful, but you're right. Their skill and effective diplomacy is crucial. We have the last question over there, this gentleman, and then we'll answer them, and that'll be it.
Hi, Talal Absi from the Bahraini Embassy, and actually I get quick comment about the...
Please, yes.
Yeah. Just about the inaccurate statement that the Saudis put down on Western Bahrain. The Peninsula Shield Forces mandate was strictly to protect vital institutions, and they didn't have any engagement with any unrest, and it's confirmed by the Bahraini Independent Commission of Inquiry in its report, and you can look it up. It was headed by
Is that in
international.
response to you?
No, I think that was in response. Yeah, actually, I don't disagree. I think by all accounts, the Saudis played a supporting role. They didn't engage. They were not involved in. They did not interact with any protest or try to put them down. So I think I probably misspoke when I said that. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So then we have, I guess, Jules, is just a comment that can be taken on its own terms. And then we have the questions raised by the gentleman here. For example, why didn't the United States force Saudi Arabia and Iran to negotiate? I think it's very hard to force people to do things. And he raised some other issues. So if there's anything that you'd like to address, any closing remarks you want to make, I would ask you, Bessma, if you want to wrap up. And any of the aspects he brought up that you'd like to address while you do that, please do.
Well, I mean, you mentioned China. I'll just say that I think the Chinese are something to be watched, particularly with the new Silk Road Initiative, which is really going to connect China to increasingly to Turkey and through to Europe, and that's going to bring China closer to the Middle East. And it's really tried to stay away in terms of getting involved, but increasingly it recognizes that it needs to play an active role, especially if it's going to go after hot markets.
Right.
It realizes Central Asia is where the demography is, the Arab world, Africa. These are all continents and regions that, if it's going to really grow, and it's stifling already in terms of its 4 or 5% growth rate, it's going to have to try to think of other markets. But that said, it's got a lot of problems, a lot of issues. It can't really make amends with Central Asia, with the Arab world, with the Turks until it really deals with its Uyghur population. I think that's still a very sensitive point,
Right.
and is still, I think, a big issue. Yeah.
Okay. Mark?
Well, but it's a big province where all the shale gas is, right? So, Uyghur territory is not, it's the number-wise, I mean, yes, it's what, 10% of, or 10 million people of 30 million people of all of China. So it's not a large number of Muslims, but the Uyghur homeland is where all the gas is. And if they didn't care about it, they wouldn't have worked so hard to make it China-fied, or whatever the word is in terms of bringing.
Hanified. Yeah.
There you go, Hanified.
But
too many for China.
it's a large number, but a small percentage.
Right.
So yeah, no. Fahad, if you have any closing remarks
Yeah,
on
just
any
on-
aspect of that you'd like to address.
Sure. Just on the gentleman's question on sectarianism, I think there's perhaps that it is a factor in many of these conflicts across the region, but I think it's a little overemphasized.
Yes.
For instance, it played no role in the unrest in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, just to name 3 countries, and even in Yemen. I know there's some people in the West, particularly, are trying to portray that conflict as strictly sectarian.
It's not.
And it is not. Sect plays a minimal role. In Yemen, the Saudis actually supported the Zaidi Imam back in the 1960s, so that tells you that it's not
And,
strictly
the
sectarian.
Houthis are fighting with the Saleh forces, so yeah, it's not sectarian.
Exactly, and
yeah.
they're both belong to the same section.
Yeah.
And the examples go on and on.
Right.
So.
Okay, great. And Mark, final comments from you?
Right. Well, with regard to your point on Russian-American distrust and Putin's complaints, I think that when the Obama administration came in 2009, practically the first thing Obama said was he wanted to improve relations with Russia, and he went out of his way to do so. The fact of the matter, I think, is that Putin actually finds that more threatening than an openly hostile relationship, that Putin sees a friendly America as one that's trying to undermine him, that he prefers to have this tension because that way he can justify cracking down on any and all of his internal opponents because, under circumstances of bad relations, if you pop up and say we should try to have better relations with the U.S., you look like a traitor in Russia. So I think that he's this is the situation that he's wanted more than anything else.
Yeah, well, we're out of time, sir. I'm sorry, but I want to thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it. Stay tuned for our next event. And if you're not on our mailing list, go to our website and sign up. Thank you very, very much. And please join me in a round of applause for our panel.